a geologist, a theologian, and a pastor. I don't know. One personality can take all these together and be a successful pastor also. And this morning, this is the last session before the lunch. I invite Dr. John Weaver to give a lecture. And Dr. John, you have time up to 1 o'clock, and it includes maybe little time for a few questions also. Please, thank you.
Thank you very much. We've really appreciated very much the warmth of our welcome by all from the time we arrived yesterday right up until the tea. Let me say that there are two things that probably are going to shape what I'm talking about. One is my understanding of geology, which is my first career. But the second, and is going to shape much of what I talk about, is my work as a practical theologian, asking questions about the nature of God and the way in which God works in the world and the desire that God has for human lives. So you will see that coming into a lot of my arguments are going to be what sort of God do we believe in and how do we reflect on that. When I began my university studies of geology, I was asked by a fellow student how it was possible for a Christian who believed that the world was created in 6 days could study geology, which presented an Earth which was something around 4.66 billion years old and a universe some 13 to 15 billion years old. I knew actually that that was an important question. If I sought to answer it by suggesting that the Old Testament, or parts of it, were simply ancient tales, myths that didn't need to be thought about too seriously, then that raised the question of why I didn't believe the Bible and only believed in and believing in some parts. If I believed the Bible was the basis of faith, then I had to explore my understanding of passages like Genesis 1 to 11, and I'm going to discuss that tomorrow. But the most important question that will underlie our reflection is, as I said, what sort of God do we believe in? As a theologian, I want to reflect on my knowledge of the world through geology and through environmental science. I have found through my studies of geology that I'm constantly learning more and more about the wonder and the variety of creation. And through my faith, I have seen a growing knowledge and understanding of the Creator God. I was fascinated in my teens, embarking as a geologist, to go around finding fossils in the rocks around the place where I lived. I found trilobites and ammonites and corals and coal measure plants. Intrigued by the structures in the cliffs around the coast, the faults and the folds and the large jumbles of conglomerates, the intrusions of volcanic rocks. And it was all amazing, and it was opening up a completely different world to my understanding. It was a world beneath our feet with a very long history, far before the history of the world in which we inhabit, where life began. I learned about the order of the created world that indicated a God of order. The processes that we see at work in the world today have been constant, which is summed up in the expression uniformitarianism, which, apart from being a long word, is the assumption that the same natural laws and processes that operate in our present day scientific observations have always operated in the universe in the past and apply everywhere in the universe. This, of course, is at a macro level, before I get Dr. Russell pointing out some of the things where this doesn't happen. We observe the constancy of cause and effect throughout space-time, which indicates a constant and a faithful God. While we also, of course, note that some scientists have pointed that nature isn't absolutely uniform, even though it does exhibit certain regularities. In geology, uniformitarianism is expressed in the concept the present is the key to the past. Now this is quite important if you're looking at geographical processes in the world today, and think about looking at the rocks where those geographical processes are being preserved some hundreds of millions of years ago, then actually this principle becomes quite important. And if you think about the time it takes to lay down a very thin layer of silt in the ocean bed, taking up to some between 1,000 and 10,000, then that begins to tell you that when you start looking at some 5 to 8 kilometers of rocks, rock layers, that actually they took a great deal of time to lay down, and therefore the Earth must be actually fairly old. Uniformitarianism was presented first in the works of the 18th century geologist James Hutton in his Theory of the Earth, and then more especially in the 19th century geologist Charles Lyell in his Principles of Geology. Earth's geological history was revealed to be a slow, gradual process punctuated by occasional natural catastrophic events. The consistency at work in the evolution of the Earth's crust points to a God of order, which is the God that we find in Genesis chapter 1, where God brings order out of chaos. The age of the Earth depends on such uniformity. It depends on the uniform decay rates of radioactive isotopes of common elements, such as carbon, uranium, and potassium. Some people who wish an old age to the Earth and the universe suggest that these rates have not been constant, so that the rocks of the Earth only appear to be old. Others have even suggested that God arranged things in this way to test human beings' faith. There is a profound theological problem with such an argument. Rather than a faithful God who has created an ordered universe, we have a God who is unfaithful and sets out to deceive. And I think that we can probably all agree that this is not the God revealed in the Jewish and Christian scriptures. I've always been inspired by the beauty of the created world. Minerals, crystals, plants, animals in their variety of form. Whether we look through the microscope or the telescope, there is something beautiful and wonderful in the intricacy and beauty of the structures of crystals and rocks in thin section, the fine detail of the oceanic microfossils, acritarchs and foraminifera, and the constellations and nebulae that are seen through the Hubble telescope. This beauty points to the creative love and joy of the Creator and the delight that God must take in this great, big, beautiful world that God has made. The size and age of the universe reveals the nature of Almighty God. We now understand the observed universe to be of an immense size and age. And I say the observed universe, we need to recognize that what we describe as the universe is what we can actually see, the most distant source of light. We don't know what is beyond that in the invisible universe. The universe is observed to be made up of billions of galaxies, like our own galaxy, the Milky Way. If we go out tonight and look up in the sky, we'll see dozens and dozens of stars which make up the Milky Way. Each one of these galaxies has billions of stars on the Sun, and it's calculated to be some 93 billion light years across. And it would take 93 billion years travelling at the speed of light. That's 186,000 miles per second. For me, that reveals the majesty and the greatness of God, the creator of such a universe. The history and development of the earth, which allows plants and animals to develop and to thrive, is also revealing the patience and the care and the faithfulness of God. We know that life originated in the sea, where it was protected from UV solar light. The gradual increase in oxygen and the development of an atmosphere allowed animals to leave the sea and through plate tectonics, has produced mountain ranges and ocean basins which offer varied environments where life can develop in different ways. The complex history has aided the evolution of complex and varied life forms. And there are various points that we could look at and say, actually, there are things that happened that enable the impact of an asteroid at the end of the Cretaceous period that saw the extinction of the dinosaurs made possible the development of mammals and eventually us. I've been intrigued by the evolution of plants and animals in response to changing environments made possible by the various mutations within species best suited to the new environment which allowed them to reproduce and to thrive. I got used to this in the area of South Wales where I lived, where I could go and walk literally up a cliff section of some 200 meters, and I could see the way in which a particular bivalve changed from looking like this to looking like this. And the reason simply because of the way in which the environment was changing, and the mutations in that original bivalve allowed a different form to develop and to reproduce. The predictable and dependable nature of structures and processes, I believe, point to a God of order who we can depend on and trust. This brings me briefly to mention natural theology, because we've already heard a little from our previous two speakers. Along with the writer of Psalm 19, we can certainly suggest that the natural world reveals the character of God. The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Natural theology has got a long history within Christian thought, and in fact within Greek thought. We can go back to Aristotle and his physics, setting out a good deal of theory about the workings of the universe, including the arguments for a prime mover, that if you have change which is caused by something, there has to be a first cause, and there has to be something that causes each change, and Aristotle presents a prime mover. Aristotle's concepts in the field of science and philosophy were followed by Christian theologians, Ansel, who believed that if there was goodness in the world, there had to be an absolute good, which he equated with God. Or we could look at Thomas Aquinas, who considered that we can arrive at the conclusion that God exists from a deeply considered acceptance of the world around us. He had 5 ways of thinking about God's existence, and they inferred a number of characteristics to such a God, that God was changeless, a changeless changer, an uncaused cause, a necessary being, a completely perfect one, and an ultimate end. As we move through the history of science, we come to such figures as René Descartes and David Hume and Immanuel Kant. And they also began rational thinking, the rational argument being the only source of truth, seeing the mechanistic way of the universe proposed by science, divided the universe into object and observer, matter and mind, the scientific world of the physical universe, and the philosophical world of the mind with its values, beliefs, and emotions. David Hume believed that truth or falsehood could be learned from experience, but the only field of demonstrative reasoning was mathematics. And he observed that the universe actually was more like a living organism than an artifact. And you could say that actually order was immanent in nature itself, rather than being derived from a designer. Criticisms of natural theology were taken further by Immanuel Kant, who considered that the argument from design was acceptable, but not logically compulsive. For Hume, he pointed out that it only proves the existence of an architect of the universe whose powers may be remarkable, but not necessarily infinite. As we've already heard this morning, modern science has revived the old design argument of natural theology. It's giving it new teeth, you might say. It presents us with an understanding of the universe that indicates a beginning and an end. It demonstrates a universe that has a fine-tuning, which is suggestive of purpose. From these two features is developed the anthropic principle, which proposes that the conditions for human life are written into the very fabric of the universe. The six constants that we see. Although Enlightenment science largely presented a mechanistic and a reductionist idea of creation, which saw the universe as a great machine, understood by reduction to its basic parts, ecology suggests an interrelated and an interdependent system in nature. This is one of the real problems with the machine idea, is it changes our relationship to the world. We become observers and analysts, managers, seeing and operating from outside nature, which is a dualistic model par excellence. But ecology is changing our view. We now have an alternative view of an organic and a holistic world. It is in the current ecological crisis that we are forced to rethink our views of creation and our relationship to it. This reflection can take different forms: scientific or mystical, classical or new age, religious or postmodern. Ecology, though, is stressing the connectedness of all things, touching on the mystery of life itself, of Gaia, Mother Earth, Mother Nature, world soul, which disappeared. Enlightenment, rationalism, is now resurfacing with ecology. The modern design argument can be summarized in this way: an ordered universe, the nature of the universe as an interrelated organism. From a scientific perspective, we see that under the diversity and the complexity of the universe, there is an underlying unity, an interconnectedness in its fundamental forces and principles, which would suggest one unifying source of creativity or origin. The anthropic principle: our universe has to take account of our presence. And then there are those amazingly tiny changes in the fundamental constants, which would lead to the fact that we wouldn't be here at all, that Dr. Russell talked about earlier. And then there's the mystery of personality. Even for some biologists, the appearance of Homo sapiens is a surprise. There is the distinctiveness of personhood. So we observe that mathematics can't be the explanation of everything, because there are, as well as the scientifically, as well as the scientifically observable, there are those things that are elusive. They are non-mathematical, such as beauty and simplicity and truth. These are prospective features. They are pointing beyond them somewhere in the future. The prospective properties of things can't be gathered up into a scientific theory of everything. No non-poetic account of reality will ever be complete. So we have to ask, what kind of universe can be the context for the evolution of beings such as ourselves? Yet these scientific arguments have the same fundamental problems as the philosophical arguments of Anselm and Aquinas. They can be pointers towards God, but they are not proofs of the existence of God, just as Hume and Kant concluded. Cosmologists can look for a super law, they can look for a theory of everything without reference to God, because all their talk about design is merely an expression of how they observe the universe. Most scientists are certainly not looking to prove or disprove the existence of God, but simply to understand the universe scientifically. Some religious believers, including some scientists, can build a picture of God on scientific models and present God as a divine mathematician, an infinite computer programmer. But the resulting defect in this, from a truly theological point of view, is that a logically consistent universe, which is the creation of a supreme mathematician or programmer, seems to leave no room for freedom. If there is no freedom, there is no relationship, and therefore no personal involvement of a personal God who seeks and gives relationship. We have to ask what sort of God is implied from our scientific discoveries. We can draw a number of conclusions. The argument from design does not establish divine existence, but poses the question to which one answer can be God. We cannot suggest that the existence of an eternal creative mind is self-explanatory, while a universe that exhibits the fundamental laws that it does is not. While we all perceive the physical world around us, our beliefs about that world will depend on the information and experience available to us. So, for me, as a Christian, belief in a purposeful creator is seen to be completely reasonable in the light of scientific research. But for a non-Christian, there may be other explanations for the nature of the universe. So how does faith engage with the discoveries of geology? As I said at the beginning of this lecture, when I began my university studies in geology, I was challenged by a fellow student concerning the relationship between my biblical understanding and the discoveries of science. But the most important question that will underlie our reflection, as I have said already, is what kind of God, what sort of God do we believe in? As a theologian, I want to reflect on my knowledge of the world through geology and through environmental science. So I'll just take a brief detour to look at models and paradigms. I find it helpful to draw parallels between the methods and models of science and theology. Science begins with observation and experimental data and produces concepts and theories. Any theory or model is a network of theories and concepts that make up the store of scientific knowledge and tradition. There is therefore no theory-free observation or experiment. The forms of questions we ask, to a certain extent, that we receive, and we need models to help our understanding. We need to recognize that our preconceptions may determine our questions, and as a result, our conclusions are always incomplete, tentative, and subject to revision. For example, many early geologists would never have sought to link the occurrence of earthquakes and volcanoes with fold mountain belts or deep ocean trenches, because they had no concept of plate tectonics and the movement of continents. So we see there is an interconnection between models, concepts, theories, observation, and experiment. The picture in theology is similar, with beliefs replacing theories and data coming from in the form of religious experience, ritual, and the traditions of faith. Like scientific observations, there are no uninterpreted experiences. The Christian experiences of conversion, of God's presence, guidance, courage, peace, healing, moral obligation, or recognition of the universe as the ordering of God, will be put down, in essence, to psychological feelings and needs, wishful thinking, coincidence, and irrational faith by those who do not hold such religious beliefs. For this reason, religious experience needs to be checked and against the accepted beliefs of faith over the past centuries and in the present. Hence the reason we have both the right-hand and left-hand sides in this reflection in the same way as we did with the science. Both science and theology use models to present meaning and to evoke understanding. Science collects data and builds a model which may form the basis of a theory. To take an example from what used to be my own professional area of structural geology, geologists collect data of earthquake epicenters, fracture patterns, ocean topography, subsurface structures, distribution of volcanoes, igneous and metamorphic rocks, together with fossils of past climates contained in sedimentary rocks. They then produce a plate tectonics model of the Earth's crust. The model, in this case, a patchwork of plates, display what cannot be observed directly, that the Earth's surface, so the crust of the Earth, the first sort of 150 kilometers, is made up of 6 plates which move alongside each other, towards each other, or away each other at the plate margins. This model then is displaying something that can't be observed directly and is therefore usually regarded as what's known as critical realism. But there is some caution about how far or how it describes the that it is portraying. It helps understanding, it promotes the development of theories, and can be confirmed or modified by further information arising within the scientific community. Theology operates in a similar way, and as it presents models of God, which are largely derived from images and metaphors contained in biblical accounts of people's experience of their relationship with God and God's unveiling of God's self to them. For example, we develop the model of God as Father, which has its main basis in the experience of the sonship of Jesus Christ, who in turn taught his disciples to address God as Father. This model is tested through our own personal experiences and those of the community through the ages. Now, the model of Father may of course be difficult for those who've had a bad experience of human fathers, which was destructive or domineering, and so it is critical that all models of God should be received and understood in the context of the whole community of faith and not individualistically. The community preserves the witness of God's revelation of God's self, which redefines all human concepts of relationship, allows us to decide what is a good father or a bad father, for example. But we must note that there are also passages that indicate the motherhood of God. For example, Isaiah 66, Hosea 11, and Matthew 23:37. How I wanted to gather you under my wings as a hen gathers her chicks, as Jesus quotes in Matthew. Additional function here, religious models then help our understanding, but also have the additional function of evoking a response from people. And in this sense, they have an important role. There are sudden conceptual changes. There are conceptual revolutions. My understanding of science, especially through my studies in geology and of theology, and my understanding and knowledge of God, is that it is never static. We can consider conceptual revolutions as described by Paul Thagard. Look at changes in understanding. There can be a revision in our beliefs by the addition or deletion of certain things, or there can be a conceptual change which adds, deletes, but reorganizes and redefines. An example in paleontology would be the move from separate creation to evolution. Revolution. Taxonomy redefined of a group of creatures created by God, but evolution suggests that human beings evolved from lower orders of animals. Alongside such conceptual revolutions in the history of science, recent disasters have led us to question our unchecked optimism and reliability associated with scientific and technological advancement. The same is true of theology, which has had its own problems over arguments concerning the divinity of Christ and the trustworthiness of Scripture. Scientific knowledge often grows slowly, with gradual additions of new laws and concepts, but sometimes science goes through dramatic conceptual changes, and laws are replaced by new ones. Thomas Kuhn described these as paradigm shifts. The development of scientific knowledge includes these revolutions, and there are 7 that we can recognize. There was the recognition of a sun-centered solar system by Copernicus, Newtonian mechanics. There was Lavoisier's evolution, relativity. There's plate tectonics theory, and I think we've been hearing about an 8th paradigm shift, maybe. I believe that I was privileged to study geology during a period when the 7th of these paradigm shifts was taking place. Almost every aspect of geology was reinterpreted in the light of plate tectonics. When I started studying geology seriously, the ice suddenly appeared off the coast of Iceland, and this was marking the pulling apart of the 2 plates, the European and the North American plate, along the line of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. In hindsight, when I look back at what I was going through in geology, it certainly prepared me for the conceptual changes in my understanding of how God works in the world. In my theological studies, I was introduced to more serious ways of interpreting Scripture and the need to reflect theologically on pastoral issues and aspects of practical theology. Also gave me an openness to spiritual renewal in the 1980s, the Neo-Pentecostal movement, and the ways in which we discovered God at work in human lives. Western theologians have also begun to recognize that there are serious questions being asked of the church by cosmology, by medical science. Christians in the developing world are asking serious questions, and ordinary people outside the church also wanting something in which to believe and are no longer content to unquestionably accept the propositions of the Christian faith. Where do those propositions come from? What do they actually mean? While science is seen to be objective, public, factual, theology is seen as subjective, personal, related to feelings. There is a recognition, though, a growing recognition, which brings these together in as much that human beings have a psychosomatic unity which requires a holistic worldview. I've been trying to think how I could really about how my and my faith come together. I want to take for the last so I want to take one example of my faith's engagement with my studies in geology. I believe that geology has played an important role in our understanding of natural disasters. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and ever ready to intervene, we have some difficult questions. How can God be both good and almighty when disasters occur? A large tsunami struck Southeast Asia in the early morning of the 26th of December 2004, bringing destruction and death to the coastal margins of Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Burma, Sri Lanka, India, the Andaman and Nicobar, the Maldives, and even as far away as East Africa. The US Geological Survey reported the movement that took place was in the order of 30 to 40 meters, pressure having built up over 200 meters. No major earthquake had occurred along since major earthquakes in 1797 and 1833. The earthquake that set the tsunami going in Indonesia measured 9 on the Richter scale. That's the equivalent of 190 million tons of TNT, or to put it another way, 9,500 Hiroshima bombs. In terms of plate tectonics, the Indian plate is being subducted, it's going below the Burma plate along the line of the Sundra Trench. This is where the epicenter of the earthquake occurred. That's all fine, that's geophysics, works quite nicely. But there's an important theological issue to it. In 1755, an earthquake off the coast of Portugal caused a tidal wave which destroyed much of the port of Lisbon, and 60,000 people lost their lives. Many of them at worship, because it was All Saints' Day, so many of them were in churches and cathedrals that collapsed on. The Lisbon earthquake is cited by many people as the turning point for belief in a loving, sovereign God, certainly in Western Europe. But we now know the structure of the Earth's crust. We can predict where earthquakes are likely to occur. We know that the evolving structure of the crust is necessary for the development of the rocks and minerals on which much of our industrial development is based. Believers are disaster as God's judgment on sinful Lisbon. But hey, why was Lisbon so sinful? What about Paris or London? And particularly, we might ask, why the young and the frail and the saintly were the ones who suffered. Such a suggestion of God's judgment is unacceptable because it blames the victims for their fate. We can observe that what distinguished the biblical prophets from their pagan predecessors was their refusal to see natural catastrophe as an independent force of evil, but was within the oversight of God. Essential to monotheism is that conflict is not written into the fabric of the universe, and that is what redeems tragedy. So we can affirm that we live as physical beings in a physical world with all its dynamic activity, a world in which earthquakes occur and people die. If it were not so, we would not know pleasure, desire achievement, have freedom, virtue, creativity, vulnerability and love. We would simply be robots in God's praise. We can observe that it's human failings that allow natural disasters to wreak havoc. This earthquake had calamity written all over it. Geologists would have been fully aware that seismic event wave struck, and lamentably warned. By contrast, in the Pacific Ocean, there are sophisticated seismic and satellite early warning systems that protected Japan recently, but they weren't in place in the Indian Ocean. The technology is available and could be made in countries, but it depends on effect. Civil wars and political corruption make such governmental warning systems difficult. Now such warning systems are largely in place. But we would also see that it is the way in which the richer nations of the world are not freely sharing their technology or their wealth, which again would have helped. Such problems also exist, of course, in the developed world. Local government in Naples has allowed the development of villas and settlements on the slopes of Vesuvius, a volcano due for eruption on a scale that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under a pyroclastic flow. Pyroclastic flow has a temperature of over 1,000 degrees centigrade. It moves at up to 750 kilometers an hour. It's a cloud of volcanic ash and dust that destroys absolutely everything in its path. So why allow people to build their villas on the side of Mount Vesuvius? Well, because of the view, of course. But who will be blamed when they are destroyed? And in California, cities continue to develop along the Andreas Fault. But you would be pleased to know that all the government have all been moved at least a kilometer away from the fault zone. We can conclude that those of us who inhabit the quieter geological regions of the planet have a particular moral responsibility to assist those who do not. But how do we fit our understanding of God into natural disasters? Descriptions of God as all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing, and ready to intervene can be unhelpful. How can God be both good and almighty when there are such disasters in this world? However, the Testament reveals a God who is self-emptying, one who gives freedom, one who is powerless, one who is crucified, and one who suffers. Now, of course, we have little problem in identifying where human sinfulness is as a free creation of the innocent, and we would describe that as moral evil. But cases of disease and the tragedy of natural disasters would be far more difficult. We cannot begin to deal with these problems without asking serious questions about how we believe that God acts in the world. And this also involves a scientific perspective. The transcendent God, the God who's above and beyond this universe, has power to intervene in human affairs. The immanent God, the one who is present within life and within creation, is actually in a position where God is able to intervene. But if we propose that God does intervene on occasions, we're left with a very difficult theological question of why God doesn't intervene more often, and hence to ask the question, what kind of God would be? I suggest that we need to keep the notion of intervention for rare defining moments of revelation, such as the Exodus from Egypt and the resurrection of Christ. Otherwise, the model of intervention is not a helpful one in considering the continual action of God. It's too one-sided, and I suggest that we should be cautious in employing it. It would be better to think of a God who does new things on the inside of creation and in cooperation with it in a way that does not infringe its freedom, though I acknowledge that we are now moving into an area of mystery concerning the way that this happens. The two statements, God is almighty and God cannot prevent suffering, are only contradictory placed out. But when we place God as an immanent God within creation, who in love is involved with the oppressed, through love combating evil, then the contradiction and scandal are turned into a mystery. As Christians, my understanding of it is my understanding of the cross that will help to locate God and suffering. God suffers will also prevent the construction of any argument that God directly causes suffering, although God may allow suffering. This is part of an understanding that God freely accepts limitations of the freedom that is given to creation and impinges on our whole concept of God. Limitless love is not incompatible with the existence of evil. It is not incompatible with suffering in the world, since this is the since this is the consequence of the freedom that is given by such loving creativity. To assert that God truly and radically shares our suffering asks questions about our understanding of God as Almighty. To proclaim that God is all-powerful means that God is the one who gives life. And the more God gives life to others, the more God limits God's self. The affirmation that God himself shares the consequences of the risk he took in creating is the most satisfactory answer that we give, and enables us to think of God and natural disasters together, as long as we can speak of God transforming the effects of suffering. With the help of modern science, the place of a dynamic earth in the availability of natural resources, and we are able to predict where and when natural disasters are likely to take place. So countries which are rich in resources and technology could counter any anticipated problems and avoid the worst effect if they had the power to accept the economic costs. For example, houses needn't be built on an earthquake fault. Farmers on the side of Mount Etna. Poorer countries cannot themselves, of course, take evasive action, and less developed countries are willing to share their wealth, their living space, and their expertise with others less advantaged. If that doesn't happen, large populations will go on living, for example, on the plains of Bangladesh, thus raising the moral question of the goodness of God. Also involves a moral issue for those of us who are able to take action. Suffering will always have a dimension of mystery, and no explanation, even one that finds God sharing the risk and the pain of creation in the cross, seems to be sufficient. But like Job, all believers in God will finally bow before the utter mystery of the divine being, from which all things arise, and to which all things must. As we close of the book of Job, we find God speaking, and we recognize the wisdom writer wants to tell us that God's wisdom is greater than human wisdom. In chapters 38 and 39, there is this great walk that God takes Job through creation. Did you know this? Did you know that? Do you understand everything? Could you do this? Could you do that? And Job is silenced by his ignorance and his inability. And then we come to the end of the book of Job. God says that everything under heaven belongs to God. There may be some value then in setting Romans 8:28 to 39 alongside this, that nothing can separate us from the love of God. God is able to hold on to us through suffering, through pain, through torture and death. The book of Job confronts us with failure and with suffering. Adequate explanation. We are challenged to rethink our theology in the face of suffering and injustice. The book of Job calls us to see things from a divine rather than a human perspective. There are for when we consider these natural tragedies. Why did God allow this? Where was God in all this? Can there ever be belief in God after the 26th of December 2004? But we can note that Job's friends were uncomfortable when face to face with that which defied their theology. They insisted on treating suffering only as a problem to be solved, rather than being willing to with the uncertainty of facing its mystery. In the end, Job is humbled in God's presence. He has been caught up into the purposes of God, of which he knows nothing. He has to trust the Creator. For us, for me as a Christian, trusting God, who loves and suffers with and for the world, looking to the death of Christ, the lengths to which God's love will go, is demonstrated there. There is no promise of freedom from suffering, nor is the mystery of God explained, but there is the promise of ultimate grace and hope. And I believe that we can depend on God's promises and God's purposes in the world that he has created. If you would like to follow the from this illustration I've used, then I would move you to a book written by another geologist, professor of geophysics, who was also part of the Faraday Institute, Bob White, who has written a book which deals with masters in nature of gold. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. John. And it was wonderful. He has shown justice to theology, geology, and you proved that you are a good pastor also at the end. And he's explained the experience of God, a suffering God who suffers with us. And now, few minutes we have for questions. If somebody feels that there is very important question, then please raise your hands. And we don't have time, it's already 1 o'clock. So, very few questions, please. I think people are hungry, so they don't want to raise questions. No questions? I understand. You are more conscious of the subject now. So, thank you, Dr. John, and we'll be back by 2:15. Thank you.